Okay, so the next thing to look at is the on-screen display. So I'm going to connect to the flight controller and go down to the OSD tab. This can take a little time to load because there's a lot to load. But once it's up, here's where you can configure your display in your goggles with all the information that you'd like to have about your aircraft while in flight. So there's a few things to note here. The first thing is this video format. It's set to auto. I don't know what triggers it, but I prefer, because I'm in North America, to set it to NTSC because most of the video equipment here use the NTSC format for video. But the problem is once you switch that, it has a narrower view than PAL, which is kind of the European standard. And there is a system message down here that gets hidden and you can't access it to move it around if you have NTSC selected. So the first thing you want to do is get this above this little green line here. This green line indicates the distinction between NTSC and PAL aspect ratios here. So I'm just going to move this up, and you can just drag it by clicking and dragging. And the system message, if you notice, it spans all the way across here. So if I go to try to drag it, if I try to drag it from the S here, and I dragged it up, that little gray box that you see is corresponding to the end of the line instead of where you grabbed it. So where you place it is going to depend on where this little gray square, dark gray square, or rectangle is. So I'm just going to move it above the line, and now I can switch over to NTSC, and now I can see everything. And if we want to take a look at the view screen, I'm going to enable the display, and you can see that that is actually showing up in the viewport. So this is what you would actually see in your goggles. This is a shot of my video monitor that's receiving a signal from my airplane. So this is actually what I'm seeing. And if you were in flight and you had your camera enabled, this is what the font would look like. So this may be a little hard to read with these thin, tiny fonts, depending on your eyesight and your preferences. What you really want to do then is in here, you can come down to the font manager and select the font that you like. And there's a number of options here. What we're seeing now, I believe, is the default. There's a bold font. You can click on one and it takes a while, but you'll see it update back here. And it doesn't update in the view screen yet because we haven't uploaded it to the flight controller. So we're only seeing these changes in the UI at the moment. I like this clarity font because it's tall once it loads. I am not seeing it update the display here, which is unusual. Okay, for some reason it's not updating. We can close this and try it again. There's the clarity font. That's the font I like. But right now I'm only seeing it in the user interface here. I'm not seeing it on the screen. If we look over on the screen, you can see it's still the default font. So what I need to do is actually select the font that I want, which is clarity. And then I have to click on this wide button here to upload the font to the flight controller. So when you do that, you'll get a progress bar showing the progress, and it's only 512 bytes, but it takes a little while to write to the non-volatile memory, probably EEPROM. And I don't know where that EEPROM is. It may just be, it may be part of the OSD chip itself. But now you can see that the font has changed in the display. I'm going to turn off my beeper. That's the beeper that tells me what's going on when INAV boots. And because it rebooted, I'm not actually connected anymore. If I try to go somewhere else, it's just not going to read it. So I have to disconnect. And if I try to connect again, it's probably going to fail. You'll see up here, failed to open MSP connection. So you probably have to disconnect your serial port or your USB connection from the flight controller. Plug it back in. Wait a few seconds. This is a stale display. So let's connect. And there we connected. So now we can go back into the OSD, which takes a while to load. and we can start configuring things again. So over here on the right are some settings that you can specify for some of the display properties of some of the values. One thing I like to change here is Imperial because I'm used to that in the United States. The problem with that is this doesn't change any of the labels in the user interface. There's just a couple of labels here. Up here where it says efficiency, there's efficiency in milliamp hours per kilometer and in watt hours per kilometer. That's just in the label here. If I have this in the UI, which it appears I have one in here, it does, when you mouse over it, it tells you in this tooltip what the item is, and it highlights it in the user interface as well. But it's just the label in the UI that has this metric kilometer in there. If you look at the label on the item itself, it correctly identifies it as milliamp hours per mile when you set this Imperial setting. So I've selected Imperial units. Voltage decimals just means you can see 1 or 2 decimals. Right now, if you look at the display, you'll see the voltage is in 2 decimals. And if I go and select, you probably can't see that. If I go and I select 2 decimal places, then it changes to 2 decimal places. So that's all that's doing. Set that to your preference. Current milliamp hours precision is 4, 5, or 6 digits. You can see how that changes. I like to set mine to 4. That's all I need. For the GPS coordinates, you can specify 9, 8, 9, 10, or 11 digits for coordinate digits, or 10, 11, 12, or 13 plus code digits, or you can strip some leading digits from the plus code up to 6. Then there's a crosshair style. If you go down here and you select crosshairs, you can see that there's an artificial horizon here. I'm going to remove that just for the moment. If you select crosshairs and then come back up here, you can, where did that go? Crosshair style. You can set it to one of the different styles, whatever suits your fancy. You can explore what they are. I usually don't have crosshairs enabled. I don't put them in my UI. So I will turn that off for me. And there's a bunch of options. I'm not going to go through all of these options. You can explore them yourself and place them in the viewport as you wish. I like to have the battery. You can just drag and move things around, but I like to have the battery voltage and the current rating and milliamp hours used and my efficiency and my throttle so that I know kind of what's going on. I don't have a microphone on my airplane. I don't have audio coming back, so it's good to have a visual indication of what my throttle setting is. And this is the altitude. And there's a whole bunch of different options you can specify here. This is an important one too, your GPS count. Right now I'm not getting any satellites. So this is the satellite count for your GPS. And when there's an alarm condition, an item in your view will flash like you see there. And if I move, I thought I moved this, I probably went away and didn't save. So it's important to save your changes. I'm going to move this up here. You can see that it moved it into view. And the system message here, the system message gives you information about the status of the flight controller. And right now it's telling me it's unable to arm. So if I were to try to arm the aircraft, it wouldn't let me. In fact, let me try it. Oh, I disabled my beeper. Let me re-enable that. That's telling me that I cannot arm. And this is telling me visually why it can't arm. It says it's waiting for a GPS fix. I've got 0 satellites right now. Earlier I was getting a satellite lock. Right now I'm not getting any satellites at all. But over here there's a few more items that you can specify. There's some alarms that you can specify. RSSI, I don't use, but if you use that, actually, I think RSSI is computed. If you're using Crossfire, I'm not really sure on this. Don't quote me on this. But you can set an alarm if you have RSSI displayed in your view. Crossfire link quality alarm, I use that one. Crossfire RSSI, SNR, I don't use those, but if you want to use those, you can. You can set alarms on altitude if you fly too high. And these numbers here are computed based on the metric default values. So there was probably a default value in here that got converted to 328.08 feet. But you might want to put something in there like you don't want to fly over 350 feet. Or negative altitude. Maybe you're on top of a hill and you don't want to fly down too low or something. You can set an alarm on distance if you fly out too far. I have an airplane, I know its range, so if I set an alarm, I can remind myself, hey, it's time to come back. Current alarm, I like to set this. If you set it to 0, it won't alarm, but I like to set it to something like 8. I know it's going to flash on launch, but I don't have audio coming back, so I can't hear my throttle, so a lot of times I bump my throttle while trying to use the rudder. So I like to have an alarm indication if I'm using too much current. So I'll set it to like 8 amps. If I just want to cruise at 6 amps, then that'll give me some indication. Flight time, you get the idea. There's various alarms you can set here. There's some switch indicator settings. I have never used these, so I don't really know what they apply to. There's pan servo settings. I've never used this. I do have a pan servo on this plane. I'm not sure what it's for other than to display some information about your pan servo. My pan servo is set to channel 12. If I select this, it's going to give me some options here. And one of these is the total degrees of movement of the pan servo. If I mouse over this help icon, it tells me degrees of pan servo rotation. A servo with 180 degrees of rotation from 1,000 to 2,000 microseconds PWM typically needs 180 for this setting. Make the value negative to inverse the direction. So you'll have to do some math, I guess, to convert the PWM microsecond value to degrees. Or actually, this is just the total degrees of movement of your pan servo. Mine's a little greater because I set my minimum to 600 microseconds, my maximum to 2400. So I have a wider range. I have about an 1800 microsecond span there. So it goes a little wider than 180 degrees. So I'd have to enter something there that refers to that. Show degrees of offset next to pan indicator. So I guess there's a pan indicator in here somewhere you can add to the screen and it'll give you some information. So like I said, I've never used this. Actually, it could be very useful to use this because I've had situations where I've been flying and my head tracker gets out of sync with the servo position. So I'm physically looking straight ahead, but my camera's looking to one side and I don't realize it. My brain's just not processing it and I think I'm flying straight, but I'm looking sideways. So an off-center warning may be useful to give you some alarm in your UI and say, hey, you're not looking straight ahead. It's like, oh, yeah, all right, we'll fix that. So like I said, I've never used this. I'm going to turn it off. Heads-up display settings, I don't even know what that's related to. It has to do with something I don't even have. But there's various things in here. One of the things I like is this clock here. This is the on-time / fly time, which means when you're sitting idle like this and you haven't armed your airplane yet, it tells you how much time your aircraft has been turned on. So it's been sitting here for almost 11 minutes now. And as soon as I arm the plane and launch it, it switches to fly time. So the timer will start over from 0 to indicate how long I've been flying. But I like having this feature because I get some idea of how long my battery's been driving the system before I actually take off. So depending on your preferences, that could be useful. But there's a whole lot of items in here. Some of these items won't even show up if you don't have certain features enabled. For example, GPS. If we didn't have a GPS on here, none of these options would even exist. They wouldn't show up. But you have a whole bunch of options you can include for GPS. One of the things I really like is this direction to home indicator, which is this little arrow here, which tells you which direction your home coordinates are. When you arm your aircraft, it saves your GPS coordinates as your home location. So when you go fly out, the GPS can tell you how far away from home you are as far as which direction you need to go back home. There's other things here besides just adding items to the display. For example, this horizon indicator. There's videos on YouTube that can help guide you set that up, because you want to aim your camera. You want to get your camera aligned so that the horizon in your view actually lines up with this horizon indicator if you want it to be accurate. But you have quite a number of groupings of information that you can include in your OSD display. There's PID controller outputs, RC adjustable values, global variables, switch indicators, crossfire receiver statistics, video transmitter, maps and radars, GPS, power limits, current meter, attitude, timers, G-force, altitude, temperature. I have a temperature sensor, and there's two built into this flight controller. There's an IMU temperature and a barometer temperature, and you can put those in your UI, drag them to where you want them to show up. And if you have a temperature sensor and you know what address it's on, you can enable that one and put it in the view as well. And if you go into the command line, which we haven't even looked at yet, you can specify an icon to associate with this temperature. And there's a few built into INAV that you can select. Like there's one that I like to use for exterior. It just says EXT, because I have a thermometer outside one of my airplanes. So you can set those up however you want. And then there's some items here. One thing I like to do also is give my airplane a name. So this is my Zod Talon GT Rebel. So I'm going to call it Rebel. And then I can put this craft name in here. And this helps me identify what airplane I was flying when I'm looking at my videos, because I like to save my videos and view them later on. So this gives me some indication of what airplane I was flying if I didn't make note of it. But there's like a heading indicator in degrees. There's a heading graph that's kind of like a rolling compass view. I like to use that. So there's all kinds of stuff you can play around with and set up the view that you want. And just make sure that when you've got it set up the way you want, hit save, and make sure you hit save before you go click on another tab over here as well, or otherwise you won't save your settings. They'll get lost. Like I've lost this one already. NTSC, Imperial units is there, so I'm going to go ahead and save it again. Now what I've done here is I've configured my default layout as indicated by this drop down up here. If you open this drop down, you can see that there are 3 additional layouts that I could choose from. So I can define up to 4 layouts here, the default one and 3 alternate ones. And these alternate ones can be selected based on the modes that you define for your OSD switch. So I could define an alternate layout. Perhaps it's got other information that isn't on my main screen. And maybe my main default screen just has the critical items that I want, like the direction to home, voltage, current remaining, capacity remaining, horizon indicator maybe, satellite count, and flight time, and system message. And then I could switch to an alternate view that's just got all kinds of stuff on it, more detail. But I've only defined the one layout, so I'm just going to stick with that. I didn't save the changes I just made. That's fine. I don't need them. But just make sure you upload the fonts that you want and to save your configuration. And then when you're done with that, congratulations, you've got a nice little OSD setup, and you'll be able to fly with all the information you need on your screen. And then when you're done with this, you can always disconnect.